COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. It has changed the daily routines for millions of people and has altered the urban life, which explains why today I'm filming this episode of the show in the comfort of my living room. Now, the pandemic has caused two types of existential crisis. The first and the most obvious one is the public health emergency. The second one, which will have lasting and not any less painful implications, is the economic slump. The pandemic has shut down thousands of businesses and disrupted markets and international trade. According to the World Trade Organization, international trade may decline by a third to levels worse than 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis. How soon will the economies bounce back, and how effectively can governments respond to the ongoing crisis? To answer these questions, Mr. Keith Rockwell, the head of information and external relations at the WTO, is joining me today from Geneva. Good morning.
Good morning, Lyazzat. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for joining me today at this early hour.
It's a pleasure.
The WTO has forecasted that international trade will fall somewhere between 13 to 32% this year. Kazakhstan is already seeing 8% decline in its exports. We're seeing imports from China drop 24% in the first quarter compared to last year. So what are some of the sectors and types of trade and supply chains that are affected the most by this crisis and by slowing trade?
Well, Lyazzat, in fact, this forecast that you mentioned, it's predicated this wide gap on two things. A, the duration of the pandemic. How long will it take us to bring the pandemic under control? And the second element is, what are the policy decisions that governments make? If they make the right policy decisions, then we could see a rapid and quite vigorous rebound as early as next year. But for the moment, there's going to be pain. And we predict, as you say, between 13 and 32% decline in trade volumes. This is in every region of the world. Every country is hurt by this. And what we're looking at here is something which is a sharp shock to both the supply and the demand side. You have factories closing, you have people staying at home, they're not buying anything. Well, they're buying some things through online platforms, but consumption is way down, production is down, and it's had this rolling, cascading effect across the global economy, and it's really quite worrisome. You're seeing huge amounts of unemployment, 30 million in Europe, 26 million in the US, vast levels of unemployment elsewhere as well. You asked which sectors are being hurt, and the answer is really all of them. I mean, if you look at commodity prices, oil, grains, immense volatility in those markets. But maybe the sector that's been hit the hardest has been on the services side, particularly with respect to things like retail and entertainment. Travel, the airlines have had a terrible time. If you're talking about restaurants, if you're talking about cinemas, the kinds of things that people like to do when they have their free time, well, they're just not able to do that now. So we're looking at damage really across the board: agriculture, manufacturing, services. Some sectors we are seeing a pickup. Those are the kinds of sectors where perhaps they would be online delivery platforms, perhaps they would be means of communicating socially in a remote environment. People are working at home. People are getting together with their friends and families through a variety of communications platforms. So you're seeing huge spikes in usage of these tools. But in terms of the overall economy, I'm afraid the picture is really very gloomy.
Now, many countries, including Kazakhstan, understandably, are either limiting or banning exports of medical products, food, and some essential consumer goods to mitigate domestic shortages. And so what are some of the regions worldwide that are most vulnerable to these changes? And how are these restrictions affecting the countries that are most reliant on imports?
Well, it's very interesting. We've been monitoring the situation very closely. We've seen 182 measures imposed by members. You may be surprised to learn that more than 50%, 57% in fact, are actually designed to facilitate trade. This is a smoothing of customs procedures, In many cases, it's reduction in tariffs at the border. This is particularly true of medicines. We're seeing a push by some governments for a global free trade deal on pharmaceuticals and other kinds of medicines. But where we were seeing restrictions, and it's very interesting, we've seen a total of 79 restrictions. 77 of them are export restrictions, which is quite amazing. In fact, governments, as their first priority, have the welfare of their people, the protection of their population. That's normal, and WTO rules account for this. But what's critically important, and this is something that was underscored by G20 ministers and leaders, is that these measures, when they are applied in a transparent fashion, in a temporary fashion, in a targeted fashion, and in a proportionate fashion. Because what we're finding is that no country is able, no matter how big, no matter how strong, no country is able to provide all the things that their people need. So when you start to sever supply chains, when you start to embrace import substitution or some form of autarky, you're creating an environment which would be make it very much more difficult for us all to get back up on our feet when we bring this pandemic under control.
As you mentioned, the leaders of G20 agreed in March that all the measures taken in response to the crisis should be proportioned, targeted, transparent, and temporary. Now, ever since, we've seen an emergence of more travel restrictions and more trade restrictions as well. Over 70 WTO members have introduced new export restrictions, and they didn't report on them to the WTO. How do you think these changes and these lack of transparency is undermining the global effort to respond to the crisis?
Well, transparency is crucial because you need to know what kind of environment in which you'd be operating. We have monitors that go beyond official notifications that are carefully keeping an eye on what's happening in these countries, looking closely at their government announcements, even looking at media reports to try and give an assessment to other members of what's happening. The reason this is so important is that if people believe that everyone is behaving in a way which is nationalistic, shall we say, in nature, then it kind of leads to again, a cascading effect, a multiplier effect. We saw this in the food shortage crisis of 2007, 2008. When people get it into their head that everyone is hoarding, that inspires a similar kind of behavior. And even though, for example, on the question of agriculture, there is plenty of food out there now, plenty of food. In some countries, they're actually disposing of perfectly good food because they can't find markets for it because of the problems with distribution. So we don't want to give people the impression that there are shortages or that people can't rely on their suppliers in other countries, because then it's going to make it that much more difficult for us to get back on our feet.
At a recent news conference, WTO Director General Roberto Azevedo said, and I quote, "These numbers are ugly and there is no getting around that." You also mentioned that a rapid rebound is possible given the countries work together and act immediately. Now, what are some of the effective policy responses, and how can governments work together to recover economies and revive trade?
Well, that's the key, working together. We saw in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the G20, which was in fact actually created to address that crisis, we saw that the response was rapid and coordinated. We're seeing a lot of coordinated activity among central banks. I think this is a very positive thing. I think there is a tremendous fiscal expansion underway. Interest rates are so low that for governments to borrow money and to make sure there's sufficient liquidity in the banking system, make sure money is available for hospitals, for small businesses, for households, this is crucial. Not every country can afford to do this. Only rich countries have the resources to be able to provide these kinds of funds. So it's important that these countries make these measures. On the trade side, we are not seeing an immense amount of protectionism beyond what you mentioned with respect to the export restrictions, which WTO rules, I hasten to add, do provide for if they are applied in the manner which we mentioned before, transparent and time limited. But having said all this, if you look at trade elsewhere, we're not seeing a tremendous amount of barrier to trade because trade's just not happening. You have difficulties not only with supply and demand, but transport. Many ocean-going vessels find that when they arrive at port, their crews are quarantined and the cargoes remain stuck at the quayside because of concerns about contagion. So trade, look, we don't need to apply any more protectionist actions. Trade is collapsing. There's no need to do that sort of thing. What we need is to find a way to revive trade. And for the moment, when you have both supply and demand under these very sharp constraints, that's going to be tricky to do.
Now, given the unprecedented nature of the crisis and the common need for countries to revive economies and boost trade, do you think this crisis can actually be an opportunity for countries like the United States and China to perhaps reset the button on their otherwise tense trade relations?
I think it could go either way. I think there's some strong efforts underway by some very important people. If you look at what Jack Ma has been doing, if you look at what Bill Gates has been doing, these are really humanitarian efforts being undertaken, driven mostly by humanitarian instinct, not so much by geopolitical concerns. But when you focus on positive stories like this, I think it lets people know that look, we're all in this together. But you do also get quite a lot of mistrust and a certain kind of nationalism. People are scared. And when people are scared, they're susceptible to all kinds of influences, which can be very unfortunate. So our view is that we are all in this together, that the only way we can effectively address this crisis is as a collective entity. That's what these international organizations, the WTO, the FAO, the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, that's what we're here for. And we were born out of the ashes of the Second World War when very wise leaders understood that it was only through collective action that the worst of crises could be addressed in an effective manner.
Now, the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO had been scheduled to take place in Nur-Sultan in June. It has been cancelled. Are there any talks on rescheduling the meetings, and how soon will the countries take the decision?
Look, it was obviously disappointment, but the fact of the matter is it was the right call. I mean, there was no other choice, and I think everyone understood that. The rhythm of the organization is such that most important decisions, most important negotiations conclude at a ministerial conference. It's when the media are there, the policymakers are there, and that tends to be the kind of environment in which we can get results. So the consultations indicated that having it the end of this year is probably too early. So they were looking at either middle of next year or end of next year. And then we got a very pleasant surprise just a couple of days ago when Minister Sultanov sent to us an invitation to Director General Azevedo, inviting the WTO membership to do a reset and to come to Nur-Sultan next year in June. The Director General and the Chairman of the General Council will hold consultations, but many of us were very pleased that this effort was made. We have great confidence that Kazakhstan has everything that's required to host a terrific ministerial.
Mr. Rockwell, you're in Geneva, and which is under lockdown just as Nur-Sultan is. Tell us how the work of the WTO is organized during this time and how working from home, working remotely has been for you.
Well, my commute is a lot shorter, so that's been useful. We're able, because of technology, to communicate quite well. I'm actually surprised at A, the amount of work that we've had, and B, how much we're able to do. The key element now is WTO meetings. We had one informal heads of delegation, which we did on a group remote software package. And what the members told us was that for things like exchange of information, the sort of the regular work of the WTO committees, exchange of views, information sharing, etc., that these kinds of virtual meetings could be very helpful. Where there was more concern expressed was on the question of decision making. Could you make decisions on the basis of a virtual meeting or a written exchange of information? And the concerns are manifold. There's concerns about privacy and about security. There are concerns about whether we can provide adequate interpretation. There are some concerns about infrastructure. But I think the biggest concern expressed by many developing countries is how difficult it is for them to be in touch with their capitals. Many people are on lockdown in capitals around the world, and dispute settlement activity is continuing. Dispute settlement panels continue to meet. They continue to work with WTO Secretariat lawyers. All of our monitoring work is in overdrive, as you will have seen on our COVID page. There's a lot of interest in what's happening. So the press folks are working hard. The business community liaison people are working hard. NGO interlocutors as well. So there's a lot going on. But I have to tell you very truthfully, it's a slightly weird way to work.
Thank you so much. And I hope next time we do an interview that is going to be in person.
I hope so too, Lyazzat.
Thank you
very much for having me.